which if you don't know what it is yet, we will get to that. A little notification probably popped up on all of your screen. So we will be recording this video and we'll be posting it on YouTube. So if you say anything, it will be recorded. But if you're not comfortable speaking, you can always type it in the chat and I can answer your questions either mid-presentation or at the end. And I guess the other housekeeping was just make sure you are on mute until the end of the session. So I always like to start things off with a land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge that I live and I work and I play on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa. I'm very grateful to be able to work, and this is where I grew up. So I'm very grateful to be able to have used their land. So to start things off, I'm going to introduce myself here. So my name is Sally Ruiz, and I'm one of the educational and outreach assistants this summer for EESC, so East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. So there's me holding some weeds from one of our weed pulls this summer. So a little background about me is I grew up in Cranbrook, and I'm currently attending university for a Bachelor's of Science in Earth and Environmental Science at UBCO. So that's in Kelowna, the Kelowna campus. A little overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to tell you kind of what EESC does, who they are. We're going to discuss the impacts of invasive species. We're also going to look at the red flags. So these are the main traits that invasive species have, and this can help you identify invasives even if you don't know the specific plant. We are also going to do a deep dive on allelopathy, as I kind of already mentioned. So to start things off, what is EESC? Some of you might know, some of you might not. So the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council is a regional nonprofit that works to mitigate the negative environmental, social, and economic impacts of invasive species. So we have two parts. We have the educational part, which is me and Megan and the other summer assistant Jude. And we also have the field part, which is as equally as important, if almost more. So they're the boots on the ground. They go out and actually pull weeds. They also do monitoring and inventories. So they go out and hike all over the East Kootenays and map where invasives are. So that's really important work. They also do different villager samplings and monitor lakes and that sort of thing. And the educational people like me, we host things like these webinars, but we also attend farmers markets, boat launches, as well as we go to school groups and teach kids about what invasives are. So to start things off, what is an invasive species and why are they so successful? So this is something that people get confused all the time. Well, what is exactly an invasive? Some people think, oh, is it the same thing as an exotic or non-native? There's a lot of terms that get thrown around that can make things quite confusing. So an exotic species is just a species that's introduced to an ecosystem and it's not a native plant, and it is likely to cause environmental or economic harm. So that's exactly what an invasive is. So it's an exotic species that causes either environmental, economic, or social harm, and it causes one of those three. The kind of term that goes with that is what we call a non-native plant. A non-native plant is a plant, or I guess animal, that is not from here. But when we call something a non-native, it doesn't mean that it necessarily has a negative impact to the environment. So a lot of the different vegetables or even flowers that you grow in your garden would just be classified as a non-native plant. But as soon as they do harm to either the environment, the economy, or society, that's when they get put into that little category called an invasive species. It's not so little, there's actually tons of them, but yeah. And one last term that sometimes people get a little confused about is a noxious weed. So a noxious weed is just an invasive plant that is legislated under the BC Weed Control Act. So not all invasive species are called a noxious weed. There are still a lot of invasives that still do harm to the environment, but those listed as noxious, those are the ones that landowners are legally required to deal with. Okay. So the three impacts that we talked about, environmental, social, and economic, and I will just give you a little kind of brief example of all three. So environmental harm is probably something that we all think about when we think of this. So if you've ever been driving and you see a field that is just covered in blue weed, that's obviously having environmental harm. It's reducing biodiversity and it's outcompeting native plants. So native plants can't establish as invasives are taking up resources and they're using up the valuable space that they need. So invasives are the second greatest threat to biodiversity and habitat loss. And that just shows how much of an environmental impact invasives have. Social impacts are the impacts to us as humans. A great example of this is the zebra and quagga mussels. I'm sure you've all seen those boat stops where you have to make sure you clean, dry your boat, and stuff like that can impact the different lakes and ecosystems humans rely on. And so that impacts us as humans. The quagga and zebra mussels can also cut humans' feet, and so that impacts us as humans. There's also a plant called giant hogweed, which you might have heard of, and the sap can cause huge blisters on people's skin. And so that's a social impact. An economic impact has to do, well, with the economy. But it also, when you think about it, that deals with landowners, ranchers, farmland, has to deal with people losing money basically because of invasive species. They outcompete and they often reduce the crop yields, or if cattle eat certain invasives, it can cause their milk to taste funny. There's lots of different ways that there can be economic harm. So sort of a summary of those impacts was it competes for natural resources, decreases crop yields in agriculture. They can even alter fire regimes, and that's a big one that more and more people are talking about these days. It reduces native biodiversity, affects human health and community well-being, and reduces recreational spaces. Alrighty, now to the interesting stuff. So we're going to talk about these red flags and we're going to go through each one by one. So we have forms monocultures, lacks predators and diseases, fast growth, multiple reproduction methods, high dispersibility, many seeds that are viable for many years, phenotypic plasticity, high competitiveness, and allelopathy. So that was a lot of terms at once, so let's go through one by one. So forms monocultures. I'm sure most of you have been driving, and again, you see those fields that are just full of blueweed or even baby's breath. Baby's breath is very common, and it will just look like a white field of fluffy little baby's breath. Or you might see oxeye daisy. Oxeye daisy are really known for taking over fields. And so there's only one plant. And so that reduces, like we said earlier, biodiversity. And these monocultures often limit different wildlife, what they can eat, what they can consume, and it also just makes the ecosystem unhealthy. They're more prone to diseases, it could wipe out, and all that things. And so this sort of leads to the second big red flag or characteristic, which is that they lack predators and disease. And often because they lack any predators or disease, they can take over really rapidly. And so that's what often leads to these giant monocultures, is there's no predators or diseases that will sort of mitigate how fast their population can grow. And often there's ample resources that they can sort of use. And so just one species will take over very rapidly. So in their native environment, there would often be bugs or pathogens that would keep their population numbers in check. But because they're not from here, there's often not these ways to keep their numbers in good amounts. Another problem is that invasive species often have faster growth than some native species. And so there are some species, like I'm sure you've maybe seen videos of different plants, but they'll rapidly take over an area way faster than you might have seen. A great example of that is with the zebra and quagga mussels. If you ever have stopped by one of our educational booths, we have this photo that shows in 6 months how zebra mussels can take over a pipe and like fully clog it. And so they grow really fast. And that has to do with multiple reasons that we'll talk about. It has to do with their high dispersal ability. It has to do with how many seeds they can produce. And they often produce many seeds, or in the mussels case, a lot of the veligers, the tiny mussels. And so they fast compete and outgrow the native species that are also trying to come up. So sometimes invasives will even pop out early in the spring, and they'll grow so fast that it limits some of the native plants being able to pop up from the seed bank. So fast growth also limits native plants coming up. Another big problem and red flag is that they have multiple reproduction methods. So some invasives produced not only by seeds, but also by plant parts. I'm sure you're all familiar with strawberries and how they sort of creep along and a new plant just pops up. A lot of invasives do that, and they produce by plant fragmentation. So when you're trying to pull out a plant, if it reproduces by rhizomes or rhizomaceous roots, it can be really difficult to control, but it's also really easy for them to spread because they can spread in the soil, and just a small part of their root system could produce a whole new plant. So a good example of that is that Japanese knotweed can reproduce from almost any part of the plant. So when you're trying to remove it and you leave just a small bit of it, it could just still reproduce. And that's why sometimes getting rid of invasives is a little bit of a tricky business. Another thing is they also have adapted to have some really cool dispersal abilities. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this plant on the screen right here, but this is called burdock. And I'm sure some of you have been hiking or with your dogs and it gets stuck on your socks or your pets, and it's pretty annoying to get out. But these guys are really adapted to be able to disperse very far. And so I guess a fun fact about burdock is this is actually what Velcro was inspired by. If you're ever curious, you can look at those little hooks that Velcro uses to stick onto things. They're almost the exact same hooks as these little burrs from burdock. So next time you're on a hike, make sure you're not spreading these little burrs around. The next sort of trait that many invasives have is they have tons of seeds, and these seeds are usually viable for many years. So a fun fact we always like to tell people is that mullein, which is the plant on the right there, mullein has those like really velvety leaves. The seeds can last up to 100 years in the soil seed bank, which is crazy. Another example on the left, that sort of scentless chamomile, a single plant can produce from 10,000 to 400,000 seeds. And that's actually pretty low. There's some plants that can produce up to 2.5 million seeds. So they produce lots.
Hey, Sally, I think we lost your audio there.
Which part?
Yep, you're good. We got you now.
Okay, cool. Did you get this slide? Or did I stop? I cut out before then.
We heard about scentless chamomile seeds, and then you said, that's not that much, and then we lost you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, not sure what happened there. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, so there's some plants that can produce like 2.5 million seeds. And so in reality, it's actually 10,000 to 400,000 seeds that scentless chamomile produces, actually pretty small for some of the invasives. Another thing is something called phenotypic plasticity, which basically just means that a plant can be adapted to many different environments and can also alter its phenotype to adjust to that environment. So a lot of these plants, they do really well in drought, they do really well in dry, they can survive in all different ecosystems. And so it's not just one specific type of environment. They're very flexible little guys. And so they have what we call phenotypic plasticity. And so the last thing that sort of combines all of the traits that we've talked about is that they're highly competitive species. And this just means that they outcompete all our native species, and they're super competitive, and that goes with all their traits. Now, the funnest red flag of all, I think, is something called allelopathy, which is when an organism produces biochemicals that can influence the growth of other plants. These biochemicals are called allelochemicals, and they can have a positive or negative impact. So in the case that we're talking about here, we are talking about the negative impact of allelopathy. And there's quite a few invasive plants that use this as what we call their superpowers. And so they can actually put chemicals into the soil through leaves or roots, and this can actually limit the growth of other organisms or plants around them. And they really use this to their benefit. So there have been many studies now that can attribute some invasive species success to the production of these chemicals. So kind of as like a little diagram to show it, we have the donor plant here, and this is the plant that produces these chemicals, and the receiver plant, the plant that is going to be affected by these chemicals. And so these chemicals are usually transported through the soil through microbes. So I wanted to kind of give you guys all an example of a plant that does this superpower of allelopathy. And on the bottom here, we can see spotted knapweed. So spotted knapweed is a known invasive that contains allelopathic compounds that can inhibit the ability of surrounding plants to grow. These infestations reduce biodiversity and increase soil erosion and stream sedimentation. So spotted knapweed produces a chemical called catechin into the soil to prevent seed germination. And so often, because this plant actually pops up earlier in the springtime and it flowers earlier than some of the native, it can put these chemicals into the soil that will inhibit other plants from germinating. And so often this plant is already established, so it won't affect themselves. Interestingly, it was introduced from Eurasia in contaminated alfalfa and clover seed. So that just is another example about how humans need to be careful about transporting plants because we accidentally brought this guy over in contamination. Yeah, right there. Got a little ahead of myself. So just so you guys all are aware, so spotted knapweed is designated as a provincial noxious weed by the BC Control Act. So we went over the term already about noxious earlier. And it is also as a regional contaminant and control species by the BC Provincial Priority Invasive Species List. So that just means the contaminant and control. That just means there's already a lot of sites in the East Kootenay that have spotted knapweed. And so at this stage, we're trying to limit control the area that spotted knapweed is in. There's different levels of priority that different invasive species will be given based on if they're already present, how well they're good at dispersing, and their impact. So if you're ever curious, you can always go on our website and see the different level that the different invasive would be listed under. So there are 3 different ways that something like spotted knapweed could be controlled by. So the big one is mechanical treatment. And this is usually what, like EESC, we would go out and do weed pulls with communities. And this is usually kind of what people often think of. And so this is basically just pulling or cutting prior to seed. So some species reproduce by rhizomes, which are the root systems. So you really have to make sure that you pull the plant and get all the little rhizome roots. Other plants, you can mow. Mowing can be an effective method as long as the plant hasn't gone into seed yet. Some you just need to bag the heads to make sure the seeds aren't spreading before they seed. So each different plant has a different control method or mechanical treatment. So biocontrol is something not everyone knows about. Biocontrols are kind of what they sound like, is using biology to control the spread. So often there are insects that are natural predators of these plants. And so lots of research, tons and tons of research goes into what sort of insect would be beneficial as a biocontrol. Spotted knapweed actually has quite a few different biocontrols. And some of these have been pretty helpful. There's one, the spotted knapweed weevil, that can burrow in the heads and go all the way down into the root system. We've even had a few sites where we're pulling out spotted knapweed and you can see these little grubs on their roots, and that's a form of biocontrol. The last is chemical, and this is just based on different site goals and objectives. And again, a lot of research goes into that. So I guess the next thing is, so we went through all of these different red flags now, and then we went through spotted knapweed. So there are actually quite a few different red flags that spotted knapweed has. So thought we could go through some of them. So a single plant can produce up to 140,000 seeds. And so we talked about how invasives, one of their red flags is they can produce tons of seeds. So that's one. It also has a deep taproot. And this affects water allocation. And so if it has a deeper taproot than native plants, it can basically steal the water from them. It mostly reproduces by seeds, but it also has root fragments that can also resprout. And so this is one of those invasives that reproduces in multiple ways. The seeds are viable up to 10 years in the soil seed bank. And that just shows, again, how long their seeds can be good for. It's often found in disturbed areas, and so it's really opportunistic. It loves sort of gravel areas. It loves roadsides. Anywhere that you wouldn't think plants could grow, spotted knapweed loves it. And the big one we talked about was allelopathy. And so those are the main red flags that spotted knapweed has. And so sometimes it can be helpful looking at red flags of invasives, because if you're not familiar with a specific invasive, it can be confusing to know what's invasive and what's not. And so often we say that if a plant has a handful of these red flags, there's a good chance that it could be an invasive plant. Now, this brings up a good point. There are some native plants that exhibit similar red flags. So yarrow, we often get people in farmers markets coming up to us and asking if yarrow is indeed invasive or if it's native. And this can be up for debate, as there's some species of yarrow that is introduced, but for the most part, yarrow is a native plant. However, I would call it one of these hardy native plants. It does exhibit similar attributes that some invasives have. It likes disturbed soil. It's extremely hardy. It's tolerable to almost any garden condition. It's really resilient to infertile soils. So it's important to kind of holistically look at a plant, because yarrow doesn't do any negative impact to the environment, to the economy, to the society, and it is from here. So yarrow wouldn't be an invasive, even though it has some of those different traits. And so the most important thing is that invasive species aren't bad, not because of what they are, it's because of where they are. And so a lot of times we have people say, well, there's native plants that have the same negative impact. And you're right, there are some native plants that in my mind aren't very nice, like there's like really prickly plants or plants that would still harm your skin or that sort of thing, but it's because they're not from here. That's what makes them harmful, is that. So kind of an overview, I wanted to kind of give just a general overview of other control methods. So we talked about with spotted knapweed, the mechanical, the biological, and the chemical. But I just wanted to give an overview again. So mechanical is manual removement. So that's using shovels, mowing, hand pulling. Biological, again, is introducing living natural predators, insects, fungi. Chemicals, again, herbicides. But there's also something called cultural. And this one can be very important. And this is through things like prescribed burns, selective grazing, crop rotation, use of fertilizer, planting native species. It also includes things like preventative measures, such as change in behavior from society level. So in some ways, cultural should be the first step. Changing our behavior to prevent the spread, making sure we're catching them even before they've had a chance to move. So that includes things like making sure you're brushing off your boots when you're leaving a hike, making sure you're clean, drain, and drying. That's just as an important or even more important of a control method than something like mechanical, because once it's harder to remove it than to stop it from coming even in the beginning. And a lot of the times we don't use one control method in isolation. We use a variety of them, and that's the most effective. And so a lot of the times we'll be using cultural, mechanical, and biological. You can kind of mix and match, and that's the most effective way of reducing. Okay, so that sort of is the bulk of what I wanted to go through. But the last sort of thing was I wanted to just give a little bit of information about EESC, what we do, and where you can find more information, and then I will take any questions. So we have tons of resources on our website, and it's simply ekiesc.com. And so this is sort of just what our page looks like. And at the top, you can see who we are. You can see who works for us, what we do, invasive species. So if you're ever curious, we have photos of sort of the top priority ones. News and events. This one's really nice. You can sign up for our newsletter. Resources. This is also a very important one. You can download digital versions of all our ID books in case you don't want to have carry around an ID book, and contact us. This is also important if you need to contact us, if you have any questions, and that sort of thing. So when you go on our website here, I'll just show you, you could just click this big button at the top, report invasives, and it'll take you to this page. And there's 3 main ways you can report invasives. So you can report them using our Report Invasives app. This app I find really great because it actually has like photos and information on the invasive. So even if you want to double check that you are actually looking at an invasive, it's a good resource to have. And it automatically does your location for you, which is really nice. You can also report online using the IAPP website here. So you just click that link and it'll take you there. Or if you don't want to do either of those, you can email us to report. You can just send us a photo, a location, and either we'll look into it or we'll look at your photo and let you know if it is an invasive or if it's not. So on our website here, we kind of went through these. Under resources, you can go to ID and guidebooks, and we have all these different ID books, which are really handy, or you can come see us at market. We will be happy to give you one. An app, though, that I always like to suggest to people is this little app down here called Seek. So Seek is a really great app. It's completely free on your phone. And what it does is you sort of just hover your phone over a plant and it will give you its best guess at the ID. And if it can't get you its species, it will give you the genus or at whatever level down in the plant world it can give you. So it can be really helpful. If you're not sure what the plant is, it could even just give you the family of a plant, and then you can go online and look. But if a plant is flowering, it does a pretty good job when plants are flowering. But like we say with anything, it's not 100% right all the time. So make sure you double check it. But I find it really helpful, especially when you don't want to lug around an ID book everywhere. And then the last thing I just sort of wanted to quickly talk about is sort of our partner programs. So these are things we are often telling people about. So Play, Clean, Go. This is you play outside, you go for a hike, you take your paddleboard, you make sure you clean your shoes, clean your paddleboard, and then you can go to a new place. So don't let it loose. That's another important one. That just means when we have pets or animals, we don't want to let them loose into the wild. This goes for, I'm sure you've seen those scary photos of when people have put goldfish in natural ponds or lakes. They actually grow to the size of their environment. So you see goldfish that are the size of my computer. And that is very unhealthy for the environment. They're not supposed to be there. So goldfish in the wild are actually an invasive species. Plant-wise, this is a really great program. So there is tons of invasive plants that gardeners often put in their garden. And sometimes it's because they don't actually know they're invasive, and other times it's because they assume that this plant isn't going to spread or that they have it contained in their garden. This is often a very misconstrued problem, and it's a very difficult problem as it's hard when garden centers sell invasives, yet they are classified as invasive, which means they do negative harm. So this is a really great resource because it actually lists what plants in your garden would be classified as invasive, and it would give you an alternative that's better for the environment, for your ecosystem, and for your garden. And so something like mountain bluet or bachelor's button or even oxeye daisy, it'll tell you why they're invasive as well as give you alternatives. And so it's a great resource for any gardener that wants to make the switch to help our natural ecosystems. And even if you're curious, it's kind of interesting to see what people have hidden in their gardens. Another important one, especially right now, is clean, drain, dry. So I'm sure all of you have heard about zebra and quagga mussels, and especially with their recent detection in Idaho, that's even closer to us now. It's really important that we're protecting our natural ecosystems and environments from these guys, especially since the mussels can last up to 30 days outside of the water on your boat. And when they're in their veliger stage, though they're small stage, they're actually microscopic to the human eye. So a lot of time boaters will say, I don't have a mussel on my boat, so I'm all good. But you can't see them with a human eye. And they can last out of the water for 30 days. So it's really important that we're actually cleaning, pressure washing, and stopping at those mandatory stops to make sure that we are stopping the spread into BC, because the amount of money we have to spend on trying to get rid of mussels is astronomical. So it's important to prevent it before it gets here. And the last thing is buy local, burn local. And this is just that if you are from, let's say, Saskatchewan, Alberta, even other parts of BC, and you are taking firewood, then driving all the way across the country, and then using that firewood, you could be unknowingly bringing pests, different insects, even seeds of plants. So it's really important that you buy wood where you're planning on burning it. So instead of bringing wood all across the province, try to prioritize buying it where you are planning on burning it. And the last thing I will say is stay updated. So we have an e-newsletter that just comes out once a month. So we're not going to spam you with emails, but it's a really great newsletter and it has tons of information. So it has information such as what we're up to, but it also has like top stories. So sort of the headlining news of invasive plants. Also has like monthly fun facts, or we do little articles about specific plants or animals or that sort of thing. It's a really great newsletter. Highly recommend you check it out. And then the last thing I will say is follow us on social media. So we're on Instagram and Facebook, and we're constantly posting really informative videos. I make a video with my fellow partner Jude every Wednesday on a different invasive plant. So it's just a minute-long video that sort of gives you some videos and photos to help ID the plant. And it's really helpful because you might not want to read through a whole bunch of articles online. So these videos are just, instead of doom scrolling on Instagram For You page, instead watch some of our informational videos. And yeah, I think that about sums it all up. If anyone has any questions, you can just take off your mic or put them in the chat. If not, we will be posting this to our
I have a question, Sally. Can you hear me okay?
yes.
So based on what you've learned so far this summer working with EESC and working with invasive species, and based on some of these red flag characteristics that you talked about today, what is your least favorite invasive species of all time?
Well, when I started, I said it was burdock. Pretty much because, well, one, that was like the only invasive I knew. But now I would probably say it's actually one of the garden invasives, mountain bluet, or even like oxeye daisy, because people have it in their gardens and they assume it's fine because it's not spreading. So that would probably be my least favorite, just because of how people are purposely having it in their gardens. Yeah, good question though. Yeah, we'll email it to you, the PDF, if you want the slideshow. The video will also be posted on YouTube. Any other questions, even if it's a question for Megan, who's the one above me. So even if you have any broader questions, Megan can answer them.
That was a great job. Thanks, Sally.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sorry guys, it was a little short, but all good. Okay. Yeah, Gail, are you wanting the the least favorite, the mountain bluet? Is that what you're dispelling?
Yeah, you said it used to be burdock and now it's what?
Here, yeah, I'll spell it. Mountain bluet. It's a common